Hi everyone, it's Will here. For today's episode of Lively Minds, the mental health podcast, I have repurposed an interview we did back in May 2023 with Professor William Tove of Singapore Management University, whose research focuses on happiness. So what follows is a condensed version of the conversation he had with my co-host Ellie and I. We talk about the definition of happiness, how this definition changes across cultures, how personality intersects with happiness, and how notions of happiness might be different for people with mental health issues. If you want to listen to the entire conversation, then just look back in our feed to find the hour-long episode we recorded in May 2023. I hope you enjoy it, and without further ado, let me hand you over to Professor William Tove of Singapore Management University.
I'm an associate professor of psychology at Singapore Management University, and my research area is focused on happiness, life satisfaction, personality. I'm especially interested in how this plays out in our everyday lives.
Can you define what happiness is?
Happiness, in the broadest sense, I'd say it's all the different ways that people can experience their life positively, or all the different ways that they could evaluate their lives positively. So that definition is probably going to capture many, many different ways that people think about happiness. Some psychologists might prefer to use the term well-being. In the scientific literature, that's what we tend to use. We talk about doing research on the well-being of people or the well-being of society. But, most people in the general public think of it as happiness. And I would say whether you call it happiness or whether you call it well-being, I think one of the important things that we've appreciated over the past 20, 30 years of research is that there's no one way to measure this thing called happiness. It's something similar to when we talk about health. There's no one way to be healthy. You just have to measure health in a lot of different ways. And all of those different ways tell you something about a person's health. And it's the same thing with happiness. So when we talk about experiencing life positively, evaluating life positively, if that's what happiness is, then it's going to include a lot of things, like the happiness that you get from eating a chocolate chip cookie. It includes the happiness that you get from making enough money to support your family and from having friends who care about you. Some people might call that life satisfaction. And it includes more like a sense of relief that you might get from avoiding a car accident or avoiding some sort of bad outcome. So all of these different ways that people can think of where they feel good about something, or they feel good about their life in some way. That to me is how I think about happiness.
I just wondered how you found how what we think of as just a general mood day to day intersects with that concept of happiness.
Yeah, I think mood is a big part of what I study, actually. So we sometimes make a distinction between moods and emotions. A lot of my studies, you could say, actually, we're looking at mood. We ask people at the end of the day how happy they felt, how cheerful they felt that day, how grateful they felt. It's something that some psychologists would consider to be a mood, which is just sort of a feeling that we don't exactly know where this feeling is coming from, but we know that we feel this way. Whereas an emotion is very often tied to some sort of specific event. And I study those as well. So we ask people to tell us what happened today, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And then we give them a list of feelings. How angry did you feel? How happy did you feel when this event happened? And that is more what some researchers would call an emotion.
I was really fascinated by the work that you've been doing around cultural differences in happiness. Can you tell us about that?
I think at a very basic level, we can all talk about feeling positively, and everyone around the world understands that there are good feelings and there are bad feelings. But some of the recent literature on cultural differences give us, I think, a more nuanced perspective on what happiness means in different parts of the world. So actually everybody around the world wants to feel good. You don't really find any cultures where people say they want to feel mostly bad. But what varies across culture might be the very specific kinds of feelings that people think are good to have. If you ask Australians and Americans, is pride a good emotion to have? Like over 80% will say, oh yeah, pride is wonderful. It's good to feel good about yourself and proud about yourself. But when you ask people in China or you ask people in Taiwan, there's a lot of ambivalence about this emotion of feeling good about yourself. And one explanation for that is this cultural dimension of individualism and collectivism. So some cultures put more emphasis on defining the individual in relation to his or her relationship. So there's no William Tove that exists as just William Tove the individual. There's William Tove who's the father of 2 kids. There's the William Tove who's the professor who teaches students. There's William Tove who's the researcher and supervises graduate students. And so in a collectivistic view of the world, each individual is defined in terms of their social roles, because how you behave or how you act is going to depend on your particular role at that moment, right? And whereas in individualistic cultures, this idea of an individual who's unique and separate from others is sort of like assumed. In that context, feeling an emotion like pride, it fits in perfectly, because if it's important for me in this culture to be unique, to be special, to distinguish myself from others, then feeling proud about my unique accomplishments, it complements that cultural goal. But if I'm living in a society where it's much more important to think about my social roles and my obligations to other people, then pride in my own achievements is not so important. So that's just one example of how some good feelings are more relevant in some cultures than in other cultures. And I think another example of this is some emotions vary in terms of how arousing they are. So for example, there are high arousal positive emotions like feeling enthusiastic, feeling excited. And then there are emotions that are also pleasant, but lower on arousal. So feeling calm, feeling peaceful, feeling tranquil, feeling serene. And both of these are pleasant emotions. But what the latest research suggests is that in East Asian cultural contexts, there's a greater preference for feeling these sort of like calm, peaceful emotions as opposed to the more exciting, enthusiastic, high energy. In the context of many Asian societies, you're expected to pay attention to the social situation and pay attention to your social roles and adjust yourself accordingly. If that's what's important to do in that culture, then feeling calm and feeling relaxed is helpful, because it helps you pay attention to what's going on around you. Feeling enthusiastic and excited, it's not so helpful, because in fact, it might make you a distraction to the social situation, which is what you don't really want to be.
In that cultural difference, there's an element of what's productive. So in the more collectivist society, the peaceful feelings of serenity enable you to be more productive in your social role. In a Western American individualist setting, chasing those sort of high energy, fun and high octane experiences of happiness, does that complement the idea that you're sort of striving for your own success and it's pushing you forward, that sort of thing?
Right, yeah. And so that's the important idea, is that some emotions are more functional and helpful in one culture versus another. But I want to say it's important to emphasize that a lot of these cultural differences are relative and context specific. Just very recently, there was a Gallup world poll where they actually asked people around the world, would you prefer a calm life or an exciting life? And when you ask that question in 116 countries around the world, the majority of people around the world want a calm life. They don't want an exciting life. They want a life that's stable and not very stressful, right? And so cultural differences I think they exist and they're very interesting, but I always feel it's important to caution that there's also a lot of similarity across the globe.
In the article that you contributed to, what you say about the lack of research about the global south was quite interesting. So the global east, global west, there's quite a lot of research in this space of cultural differences and notions of happiness, but you were saying that there needs to be much more work done about the global south.
That's
Is that
still
right?
true, yeah. I think it's just so important because I'm sure that in anthropology and sociology, maybe there are more varied perspectives, but a lot of what we think of in terms of individualism and collectivisms in psychology has been informed by comparisons between Eastern and Western cultures. But it's very difficult to generalize the findings to the rest of the world. So Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, each of these continents encompass so many other cultures, and they don't exactly fit this model of Asian collectivism. We assume that Latin American countries are collectivist in the same sense of valuing family and friends and relationships, and that's all true. But when you ask Latin Americans whether they see themselves as individuals or whether they see themselves as connected to other people, they don't see themselves as connected to other people the same way that Asians do. And there's actually much more acceptance of self-expression in some of these Latin American cultures, and some Latin American countries are a lot happier than we would expect or predict based on their GDP.
One thing that was quite interesting in a video that I watched about your research before this interview, the connection between meaning and life satisfaction, feeling that activities, actions that you do have meaning, combined with being satisfied by those actions, those things correlate to support happiness.
They have a similar basis. When we talk about having a sense of meaning in life or having an experience that's meaningful, there's a lot that goes on into that judgment, but there's also some overlaps with satisfaction, because whether we find something meaningful or not also is going to be influenced by our standards, our values, our goals, what we want out of life. So when I'm asking respondents at the end of the day how satisfied they were with their day, we're thinking about what we wanted that day to be like, what we want our life to be like. So we're thinking about the standards that we have. What's the ideal situation that we'd like to have? And satisfaction is this judgment where we're comparing how the day went or how our life is going versus how we want it to go, right? If a student who really cares about being the top student, an A+ is going to mean a whole lot more to that student than another student who's maybe not so focused on grades, but maybe just focused on learning something that he's really interested in learning. In both cases, these are people who feel like they're coming pretty close to meeting those standards that they've set in life. They're doing things that they value, that they think are important. And how well they actually are able to do those things is going to influence how satisfied they feel with that day and how meaningful they feel the day was.
I guess for most of us, we don't necessarily consciously wake up and start the day thinking, what are my expectations and aims? It's a subconscious thing that you are constantly doing. And yeah, you're totally right. If you think about where you're suddenly in a bad mood later in the day, it's often because something has derailed what you expected to happen that day.
You're right. We don't necessarily think about it so consciously, but that's what values are, actually. Our values are kind of like goals that permeate our lives. So if you value family, it's not really a goal that you accomplish in any one particular instance. You don't say, okay, I'm going to take my son to the zoo, and then you're like, all right, that's it, I've done it. I've accomplished my value. I've shown that I value family. I've accomplished everything. Because there's another day after that, and this child is going to be around for a lot longer than one day, right? So values are sort of like guideposts for our lives. They're sort of like guiding our preferences and priorities every day, not just any particular day or a single day.
I think it's really interesting as well in terms of the connection between people feeling satisfied because they find meaning in their life. I've heard a couple of war correspondents talking about how when they're in the field, when they're in that war zone, they feel an immense purpose and meaning to what they're doing. They're really driven to do that and to be in that war zone, but they they certainly don't find it satisfying. They find it incredibly scary.
That's where it becomes really interesting to think about these two concepts, meaning and satisfaction. And there's a broader theory or theoretical perspective in this literature on well-being that distinguishes what some people call hedonic forms of well-being and, for lack of a better term, eudaimonic well-being. And actually, we don't really have a good definition of what eudaimonic well-being is. It's just sort of like all these other aspects of well-being that are not about feeling good or bad. Hedonic well-being it tends to be positive emotions, negative emotions, satisfaction judgments. It's when we tend to judge how good or bad things went. That's one way to think about happiness and well-being, but we don't always do things because they feel good, and we don't always avoid things because they feel bad. It plays out a lot in our everyday life, but there are times where we just force ourselves to do certain things, even if it's difficult, but because it's important to do. And then that's where you start to see that some things that are meaningful are not always satisfying.
You mentioned that you studied personality, and I just wondered what your findings were about how people's different personalities affected their level of happiness.
So I think personality is actually one of the stronger predictors of well-being. Extroverts tend to be happier than introverts. They tend to report higher levels of life satisfaction. And one reason for that is that they tend to prioritize their social relationships, which when you look all around the world, not looking at personality, but just looking at who has social support, that is a pretty robust correlate of well-being. It's not about having lots and lots of friends, but it's just having a person, having somebody who, if you needed help, that they are there. And some of the surprising research that's been done are these experiments where they actually get people to act in a more extroverted way, smiling more, just talking more, and then you ask them how they feel after they interact with this other person. They're in a more positive mood. They feel better about it. And the surprising thing is, like, even when you ask introverts to act extroverted, even introverts are in a better mood when they act extroverted. So the personality research is interesting, not because it shows that certain individuals are predisposed to be happier and to be more social. It's important because it's highlighting certain behaviors that people do that can contribute to their well-being. So you don't have to be born extroverted to benefit from being more social. You can learn some of these behaviors and some of these skills and you come away with similar benefits.
I guess, though, as well, would it not be the case to say that the correlation between acting more extroverted and reporting better well-being is also in large part due to cultural norms? Because as an introvert myself, I'm very aware of the sort of debate around how Western society in particular is very skewed to favour extroversion over introversion. And so I do wonder to what extent that research might actually be, how we extrapolate the cultural pressures, if you like, of extroversion, and this idea that being extroverted is a good thing might impact an introvert acting extroverted's happiness, if that makes sense.
That's a really great question. I wish that there were more of those experiments around the world, like across different cultures. I think most of this literature has been done, I think, in the US or in the UK. And so you're right, the findings might not be so strong in other cultures.
We're just taking a very short break to ask, if you are enjoying this episode, please take a few seconds to rate or review us if your podcast app allows. We are an entirely volunteer-run show led by people with lived experience, and rating our show or telling a couple of friends about us really helps to spread the word. Now, back to the show. I'm really interested to focus in on how definitions of happiness are nuanced through the experience of mental health problems. And I was just wondering, first of all, whether you can speak to that for a moment.
There's different perspectives on this. One perspective might be that we have really good days and really, really bad days, and that's normal. That's just life. And so when we talk about people who might be experiencing difficulties with their mental health, one perspective is that, well, these are people who are at the extremes of these emotional experiences and for much longer periods of time than would be considered normal. I mean, outside of the range that most people tend to experience in day-to-day life. Another perspective is that for certain forms of well-being, we might not want to ask people themselves how they're doing. So, for example, eudaimonia, living an excellent life, living up to your potential, which is an idea that was borrowed from Aristotle. Some people say, well, that's a judgment that really shouldn't be made by the individual. It should be made by another person who can be, quote, more objective, an observer. And the argument for that is that what if they have a drug addiction and they're really not doing well? They're not able to keep a job. They're not maintaining their relationships. And you ask this person how happy they are with their lives, and they say they're just extremely happy and they think they're living a wonderful life. Some people would say, like, you shouldn't take their opinion seriously. You should ask somebody else who would probably be more accurate in this case. Because when we talk about living an excellent life, that has to be in line with cultural values. And I mean, as somebody who studies subjective well-being, I always feel a little bit ambivalent about that perspective because my research is all based on self-report. I'm asking people to tell me how they feel about their day and whether they are satisfied with their lives and whether they feel like their lives are meaningful. And so I feel like it can be very difficult to completely dismiss the person's own subjective perspective on how they're feeling about their lives. I worry that, it can get a little bit dangerous when we argue too strongly for an objective third-person perspective. Although I understand the example, I feel like there's something of value in a person's own subjective experience of their life that we ought to pay attention to, that we ought to value in some way. It's not the only way, and it can be very helpful to ask friends and family to rate a person's well-being. I think that's also worthwhile to do. But to completely dismiss a person's own subjective experience, I think, is too soon to toss that out completely.
Just talking from personal experience, one thing that I've really noticed is that for me, happiness is always thwarted by the seemingly hyper-awareness that I have about the emotions that I have at any given moment. And one of the things that I've realized for myself is that I think the more that I monitor my own emotions and feelings, the more I'm aware of my own emotions and feelings, the less likely it is I am to feel happiness. And the times that I actually feel happiness is when I lose myself, when I forget myself, when I'm in a situation that is very satisfying, as you say, and kind of meets all those criteria that we've been talking about, but fundamentally where I'm actually not self-monitoring what I'm feeling at that moment in time and I'm just losing myself.
Yeah, it's a really interesting example that you give. And I think there are some scholars who have also noticed a similar phenomenon in terms of people who value happiness to an extreme. So there are some individuals who, like, it's not just like that they care about being happy, but it's like if they're not happy enough, they feel like it's a failure in some way. And what happens with these people that makes it difficult for them to stay happy is actually the monitoring of how happy they are. And so you're right. It seems like that gets in the way of people actually being able to enjoy their experiences. And I think being able to just be in the moment, mindfulness, awareness, this idea of just observing your experience without judging is a really important idea, right? And just accepting that the emotions don't last forever, actually. I mean, they're not supposed to. Actually, there's some research suggesting that people who actually have problems shifting their emotion from one situation to the next, it's actually not good for their mental health, because if you have a functioning emotion system, whether it's feeling happy or feeling sad, you have to be able to respond to the next thing that happens in your day. So trying to hold on to the happiness or clinging to that fear or sadness, neither of those things are functional in the long run. It's a little bit different from saying not to experience sadness and not to experience happiness. No, we all need to experience these things from moment to moment, but there's a point at which we need to let go of that emotion because it's no longer relevant to what we're doing, right? My colleague, Lana Catalino, and it's actually Lana who developed this idea of prioritizing positivity, which is planning your experiences so that you can have a more enjoyable day. If you want to have lunch with some colleagues that you really enjoy at work, it's sort of like finding a way to make time in your day so that you can have lunch with them, as opposed to just sitting at your computer and having lunch by yourself. The focus isn't so much on how intense the happiness is, it's just more like the frequency. So trying to increase your opportunities to experience these happy moments without worrying how intense or how strong that happy feeling is.
No matter how we define it, if happiness is imagined as some kind of one-dimensional perfect state, then I think it can start to feel a bit intimidating, almost unreachable. And I think there's a danger in that. When we fetishize happiness, we risk making it something we believe we can never quite attain. Personally, I've found value in that space in between, a place where I'm not being pulled sharply into one emotional direction or another, a kind of peace, a kind of equilibrium. And for me, that space holds real value. That space is what I might call happiness. Thank you for listening. As always, you can find signposting to support at our website, livelymindspod.com. And please get in touch on social media. We are the same handle across the platforms, @livelymindspod. Until next month, bye bye for now.